That is exactly where that baby would have spent his entire life, in a place where people go to urinate, defecate, and vomit. That child was not born into the warm depths of a mother's gaze, but the cold, shallow water of a toilet. And that child stayed there, and he cried. He cried for his mother. This defendant heard him crying. She heard her child crying from that toilet, and she left him. She left him in that toilet bowl. She left him immersed in the soiled water. And she left him behind for someone else to deal with in an area where she leaves waste. That child spent the first minutes of his life cold and alone. First 2 weeks of his life in a hospital. And the first 7 months of his life without a name. Forget a silver spoon. That child would have been lucky to have been born without toilet water in his mouth. And that is the Teresa Smith that stands before this court to be sentenced on that Class D violent felony. After her crime, Ms. Smith was interviewed multiple times, both by law enforcement as well as the Orange County Probation Department. In each of her interviews with law enforcement, whenever she was told her child, by divine intervention, had lived, she had no reaction. This court was deprived of the ability to see that videotaped interview, to see the defendant's callous indifference for the human life she brought into this world. In her pre-sentence investigation report, a trained professional who undoubtedly has interviewed hundreds of criminal defendants about their crimes described the defendant's actions in the present offense as vile and horrific, that she disregarded the basic human instinct to protect and care for the child and instead abandoned the child in a toilet and fled the motel in search of heroin. That pre-sentence investigation report is replete and filled with excuses. Excuses that she panicked. Your Honor, after she gave birth to that child, the defendant cleaned herself up. The defendant changed her clothes. The defendant went to get her phone. She realized her phone didn't have a charge. The defendant got her phone charger. The defendant plugged her phone charger in and charged her phone and waited. While she was waiting for her phone to get a charge, her baby sat in that toilet. When her phone finally got a charge, she made a phone call. Not to the police, not for emergency help, for a taxi cab. The defendant then waited for that taxi cab, again, while the child remains in that toilet. When the hotel staff came and saw her leave, she did not mention anything about that child being in the toilet. She did later admit she knew if that child was left in that toilet unattended, that child was going to die. When she got to the taxi cab, she didn't tell the taxi cab driver, there's a child who needs help. She instead told the taxi cab driver, take me to Newburgh, where she then went and bought drugs. When she bought the drugs, she did the drugs with the person who sold them to her. Didn't tell that person that child needed help. She never mentioned anything about that child to anyone who could have, and by God, would have helped that child. The PSI repeats the defendant's words that she was scared and panicked. The evidence belies the fact that she panicked. She was calm. She did everything she needed to do in a methodical fashion to leave that room with minimal consequence to herself and to herself alone. PSI notes specifically the defendant could not verbalize what she was scared of or why she panicked. If she has the audacity to make herself the victim of this crime because of drugs she took, that she chose to take, or for the fear of the consequences from actions she picked, I truly hope this court sees through that wholly unsympathetic, pretextual, weak excuse for these actions. Teresa Smith cannot be the beneficiary of her own poor choices and her own illegal conduct through mitigation of her criminal sentence. That child is alive solely because of the grace of God. not the deeds of Teresa Smith. Because while she did everything she could, methodically and calmly, to leave, that child remained in the toilet. A toilet that was essentially going to become a tomb. There was no panic from the defendant, simply a counter-instinctual indifference to that child's life. Your Honor, Teresa Smith is no stranger to the criminal justice system. This is not her first offense. Her history is full of chances. From receiving a youthful offender adjudication to receiving a very lenient sentence on her petty larceny conviction. Even in this case, after this court told her it was her final opportunity to plead guilty and have this court limit her exposure to 15 years, this court gave her a second chance. But it gave her a better chance because on the next date, it lowered the court's promised sentence to 12 years. Your Honor, I'm asking this court to stop with the undeserved chances. This defendant has done nothing, not a single thing, to inure any of the benefits being conferred upon her. The people are going to ask this court to sentence the defendant to the 15 years plus post-release supervision as outlined when this defendant did plead guilty. That is the fair sentence. Justice requires that this court sentence the defendant to no less than the 12 years that this court is limiting itself to. Because while the criminal justice system has already given Teresa Smith a world of chances, this defendant didn't give that child a chance in the world. Thank you.
Ms. Gillies?
Oh, that was very emotional, Mr. Kelly. I believe it was complete.
You can direct your comments to me.
I would ask that you disregard most of Mr. Kelly's highly emotional and rather vile interpretation of these events. Ms. Smith was heavily addicted to heroin at the time that she gave birth. She didn't know she was going to give birth that day. She knew she was pregnant. She was not taking care of herself. She was not capable of taking care of herself. She was not capable of taking care of anybody, including a baby. She didn't think, was she thinking about the baby? No, I'm not saying this is mitigation. She was thinking about her addiction. She had been using drugs the night before. The drug high had come down. She was desperate for drugs again, and the baby was not something she was thinking about. Mr. Kelly has seen the pictures of the hotel room. There was blood everywhere. It was a bloody mess all over the hotel room. There was, it was to the point that I understand that when the maid came in right after Miss Smith left, she ran right back out again. She didn't know what had happened. She didn't look around. She ran for the manager and I believe called the police. Since the manager had seen Miss Smith leave, obviously they were going to go in and take care of the motel room. It wasn't a situation where the baby was left unattended in a private house, in a dumpster, on the street, someplace completely unsafe. It was in a closed room that was inevitably going to be looked at in a very short period of time. I'm not saying that is mitigation. I'm not saying that Ms. Smith had that in mind, but that is the fact. That child was going to be discovered in no time at all, and was in fact discovered and rescued and taken to the hospital immediately by the first responders who got there fairly quickly. Ms. Smith was at that point so deep in her drug addiction that the combination of all these things going on was a panic situation. Giving birth is not an inconsequential event. It is not like having a cold where you can go about your business. Most people give birth in a hospital with a dozen people around them, and women are still crying and screaming and in pain, and nobody knows what's going to happen. It's a very big event. In this case, Ms. Smith's birth happened so quickly, and it came out, and the baby came out so quickly that it was almost hard to understand, I think, for her in her drug addicted state. She went for her safe place, which at that time was drugs. That's the only thing in her mind, was thinking about where she could get relief from all this blood, all this stuff, all these things going on. She went for drugs because she was badly addicted. The probation report acted as if, oh, it's recreational drugs. She went for herself. No, she was very, very badly addicted. She was homeless. She was doing everything she could to get drugs, and was thinking, could not support herself, could not function in the world on her own. She couldn't protect herself, let alone a baby. I ask that you take that into account and disregard Mr. Kelly and the probation officer who seemed to think who acted like this was the vilest thing in the world. Not all mothers love their babies immediately. Some of them never do. Some of them never want them. There's a lot of reasons why, even though there's a law that says, oh, if you're a parent, you must protect your child. There is a law that says that. There is a duty to protect a child if you're a parent. And she recognizes that. She's very remorseful. If she had not been so deep in her addiction, there was no chance in the world she would have behaved in this way or failed to protect that baby. She did intend to give him up for adoption anyway, but that morning, I don't believe she could get her mind around what was going on. All she could think of was drugs. I must have drugs. I would ask you to take the medical situation of having a baby, the blood all over the place, her addiction, and her now very clear remorse about what happened. She took responsibility in terms of signing over the baby so that he could be adopted as soon as humanly possible, and did that immediately. She didn't run from the police. She was out there available. She didn't fight with them. She was cooperative. She told them what was going on. She obviously wasn't trying to hide her connection to this. She couldn't hide her connection to this. This was a motel room that was registered to her. Of course she's going to be held responsible. She knew that. But mostly she was thinking about drugs. I need drugs. That was her safe place at the time. It will hopefully never be again. When she goes to prison, which is mandatory, there's some prison is mandatory, obviously. She will get drug treatment. They will give her drug treatment. She will get counseling, I hope, to help her with her other issues. She's been enthralled to drugs for years now. She has not been able to live her life. She started using drugs at 14. And I would ask you to take all of that into account and sentence her preferably closer to the minimum, which would be 5 years, but taking into account all the things that her wasted potential here is tremendous. She started out a good kid, and then drugs got her and wrecked her. She hopefully can come back and become a productive member of society. This sort of thing will never happen again. I am certain of that. She has family and friends here in court. You've got letters from people who told you what she was like as a child and how she's deserving of sympathy. And nobody is saying that this baby didn't deserve better. He did deserve better. She did nothing active. She didn't try to drown him in the bathtub. She didn't put him in a dumpster. She didn't wrap him in a plastic bag like some people have. People who've done those things often will get a much lighter sentence than what Mr. Kelly is proposing here today.
Probably not in this court.
Maybe
Anything
not.
further?
Okay. Judge, I would ask that you sentence her at the minimum, the 5 years or close to that. Thank you very much.
Ms. Smith, the law affords you an opportunity to be heard before I impose sentence. You're not required to say anything. But if you do want to say something, now would be the time to say it. So, one of the things that I noticed throughout the course of everyone giving their statements, obviously, both sides gave what I would refer to as emotional pleas to the court. One thing I noticed is no one mentioned the baby's name. Miss Gillies referred to the baby as an it or a boy. Mr. Kelly referred to him as a he or a boy. I'm sure at this point the child has a name. Would anyone like to put that name on the record?
Your Honor, not only do I not want the name on the record, as I specifically said in my sentencing argument, that child has spent 7 months of his life without a name. And that speaks to the gravity of this crime.
Judge, my understanding is that when they went to family court, he was named Brian in December. And then
So while Ms. Gillies called Mr. Kelly's recitation a vile interpretation, I would indicate it was simply a statement of the facts. Certainly, those facts were sprinkled with emotional arguments, but nonetheless, they were facts. Facts that he put on the record, facts that really are not in dispute. It's interesting, our Court of Appeals has essentially gutted what was previously and still is referred to as depraved indifference to human life. On a regular basis, people who are convicted of depraved indifference to human life have their convictions overturned on appeal. So much so that prosecutors rarely present cases of depraved indifference to human life as a mens rea to grand juries and to juries. A person has a depraved indifference to human life when that person has an utter disregard for the value of human life, a willingness to act not because she means to cause grievous harm to the person who is injured, but because she simply does not care whether or not grievous harm will result. In other words, a person who's depravedly indifferent is not just willing to take a grossly unreasonable risk to human life. That person does not care how that risk turns out. Depraved indifference to human life reflects a wicked, evil, or inhumane state of mind as manifested by heinous and despicable acts. It is evinced by conduct that is wanton, deficient in a moral sense of concern, and devoid of regard for the life of another. I cannot think of any greater description or more accurate description as to the facts of this case than the very definition of depraved indifference to human life, which I just read on the record. It's interesting that Ms. Gillies would argue that the child was going to be discovered. I don't think Mr. Kelly disagrees with that. The question really was the child going to be discovered dead or alive? And I don't think anyone disputes that the actions of Ms. Smith were unfathomable in terms of an utter disregard for whether or not that child was found dead or alive. She put the most vulnerable being imaginable at risk of death because of her depraved indifference. She chose heroin over her newborn child. If nothing else, this case should be the poster child for people avoiding the use of heroin. I agree, the use of heroin and the addiction to heroin is no excuse for the actions that occurred in this case. However, even the people through their plea bargain tacitly acknowledged